everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. In today's episode, which is the 13th episode of this podcast, I'm going to talk about something really specific. I'm going to be talking about that photo. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll definitely explain later on. But for those that know, they know. So, before I even start, it is going to be graphic. There are some descriptions which are very difficult, but I find it necessary because every time I even talk about it or try to consciously think about it, I begin to cry, and honestly, I'm kind of besides myself, and talking about it seems to kind of help, but also I do feel the loneliness in general and the inability to even talk about these things or the difficulty of it. And again, I've still been receiving almost every day messages from people thanking me for doing this, who are incredibly lonely and alienated and terrified and worried, and see in this podcast a kind of virtual hug, a kind of affirmation of their grief. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about something quite intense. It might be very difficult, and at the moment, I've tried recording this for the last couple of hours, and every time I do, I kind of break down into tears, and so that'll probably happen again, but we'll get through it. Before I start today's episode, though, I do want to say that I opened up an Instagram account for this podcast. And on there, I not only advertise each episode and put on these clips, but also post other things, pictures, not like the pictures I'm describing here, but as in whatever, other stuff. I'm trying to curate a kind of Instagram version of this podcast. And so, yeah, follow me there if you like this podcast. And, yeah. Okay. I saw the picture. I saw it the day it came out, and I didn't even know what I was looking at, and since I've seen it 2 or 3 times, and I can easily say it's the worst thing I've ever seen, and especially because I know the exact context within which it comes from. For those that don't know, about 3-4 days ago, the same day as the Flower Massacre, the infamous Flower Massacre, where the Israelis killed about 100 people who they had been starving for the last few weeks, months, who were rushing to the few aid trucks that had entered the north of Gaza, and so were massacred, hungry. In the same day, there were reports coming out that the Israelis had run over several Palestinians with tanks. And one photo came out, which was, I believe, taken by an Israeli soldier, of a body of a man, completely crushed, unrecognizable, and just flipped inside out. When I first saw it, I thought, it looked like tomatoes, just kind of the redness of it all. And one terrifying detail is that his arms were zip-tied. They were broken, but so this person was detained and then tortured, presumably, and then crushed to death by an Israeli tank. I've never seen anything like it, and the reason I'm doing this episode is because I can't get that image out of my head, and it's haunting me, and It's really weird how after 5 months of this, and this isn't my first experience in witnessing such horrors and seeing such images. There's a lot of flashbacks to, the explosion in Lebanon, but also just, 2016 in Syria and the daily images of these horrible atrocities. Before this moment, the most well-documented war in history is the Syrian civil war. So, I want to talk a bit about this picture. I want to talk a bit about how do we go on from here. I don't know, even if there's a ceasefire tomorrow, even if, whatever, Zionism falls tomorrow, like, how do we mourn the death of one starved child, let alone these tens of thousands? I really don't know. I really have no answer. And it's just horrible. I find myself trying to sleep and this picture comes into my head. And so if I was distracting myself before, I am extra distracting myself. I have these apps on my phone that kind of tracks how much time I spend on it, and it's just through the roof, you know? And there's this one problem, which is that for those of us who have seen this picture, or in general who have seen pictures like this, we don't want to talk to each other, you know? Because once we're talking to each other, we want to talk about other things. And so really there's no one to talk to about this, and I think a lot of us feel very lonely. God, I also feel so fucked up talking about feeling lonely when things like that are just happening. They are actually happening. I am very much in a place now where all these things only happen, you know, through the phone, never with my own eyes. And so I constantly find myself living that duality and resisting that duality, resisting this thing which I know a lot of people, especially in the West and the global North, do, which is like fictionalize these things, you know, and make them more distant, but it's real and they are really happening. And this actually happened to a man. And in his last moments, you know, and some of the descriptions of some of the people talking about this picture and what it must mean of what that man experienced at the last moments of his one life on this earth, and just how it's allowed to continue. And again, how this is one atrocious example of the kind of political violence that we're seeing so many other places. This is horrific in a kind of uniquely cruel way. But there is genocide in Sudan. There is so many of the similar atrocities. It's less documented in this kind of HD photographs, but it is happening in Congo, in Ethiopia, in Syria. I mean, there are so many situations of horrendous violence, and it's just allowed to happen, and no one is stepping in to stop it. And the problem is the only people who could step in and stop it, A, are like funding and supporting these things, but also these are the imperialist powers. Like, why would we expect them to be on the good side or whatever, you know? Like, we really have no, I don't know. There's like a complete collapse of this idea of the international order, or like international law-based rule of the world. And in the same way that when the Israelis bomb one hospital and then wait a couple of days and see that, oh, no one's going to stop us, then they bomb another, and then another, and now they've bombed every hospital in Gaza. And in the same way they're doing with these massacres of people seeking aid. But in a more macro sense, this is the same thing that's happening with genocides, with these ultimate forms of political violence that are just allowed to happen. And so they're all learning from each other. Oh, they're allowed to do that to those people? Well, we have a group of people we want to do that too. Oof. I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm definitely seeing the same old defense mechanism of me intellectualizing things to escape the soul-crushing acceptance of the fact that there's nothing to be done, or at least there's only so much that can be done. And aside from that, I just need to accept. And in this case, there's no intellectual solution to trying to comprehend some of these things. A lot of it is just very emotional. And it's much more difficult to feel than to think, especially if you're kind of socialized male or whatever. But it just, again, and I have been thinking and I've been quoting a lot of Mu'taz because I think he has been articulating things so accurately, but also saying things that have just been sticking. And he said this one thing in the interview he had done with Al Jazeera. And it's actually the same thing that Plestia said in her interview with Middle East Eye, I think, which is, the worst things I did not photograph. And so here's a case where, is this what he was talking about? Is this an example of something that for him was so atrocious that he didn't photograph it? And in that way, I'm thinking about, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it is an Israeli soldier that photographed this, because I'd seen it circulated on these kind of telegrams of Israeli soldiers mocking the death of this man and this torture. But Moataz himself reposted this photo, and a lot of Palestinians posted this photo in a kind of gesture of, this, we want the world to see this. And again, this makes it so difficult. And this is the crux of the issue, which is, we cannot look away. Even as horrible and atrocious as it is, I don't know, this is an extreme example of this thing that I've been talking about, which is, if it's what they want us to see, I don't know how to react other than in agreement, or to say, I don't know how to explain that actually, because I have heard other Palestinians talk about the fact that these images have moved no one, or rather, how much more can we show? What is the worst photo that'll come out that'll change people and make people move? And so how much are we debasing the living and the dead in our pursuit for some sort of public movement or public opinion shift, which is happening, but nowhere near to the extent that it needs to. I'm doing it again. There's a kind of dilemma. I feel like I'm going crazy, and this picture is a prime example of it, because it is just jumping into my head when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm trying to do anything, really. And so that's sort of debilitating me, but at the same time, I don't know what else I should be doing. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many conceptions of just move on. Like, there's a part of me who wants to get fucked up by this. There's a part of me, and I know my mother will call this masochistic, but it's like, I feel like the correct response to these tragedies is to let it fuck you up. But at the same time, again, is that just me trying to intellectualize it and be like, okay, well, I let it fuck me up, and so now I've done my duty or something, you know? Sorry. Again, it's been really difficult to talk about, because every time I bring it up and I actually try addressing it, it comes back to me and it hits so hard. And I think one of the hardest things to do is to accept that that is part of the same reality that happened. I think the first time I experienced this with this current situation was October 17 with the bombing of, I think it was a Shifa hospital or Ahle hospital, wherein they had used this special type of munition which doesn't really explode but sends out these blades. And I saw one of the injuries, and there's just this realization that yes, I had been doing this thing of distancing myself from these experiences, that this is real, that these weapons are real, that when people talk about how for the Israelis that Gaza is almost like a laboratory of these weapons that then they can sell to other states and call them battle tested, that these weapons are real, that this happened, that there are currently, as I'm recording this, 2 million people stuck in the world's largest concentration camp, being starved to death and bombed to death, and so this one image of this one cruelty that, again, it's the one that we've seen, and there are so many that we will never see, but will live on, and it's just so fucking cruel. And I don't know how to go on. I don't know how to continue, quote unquote, normally. And this is why I can't leave the house. I can't talk to people. I can't do anything with, unless it's like a very select few group of people. I don't know. It feels like a betrayal. Again, and it's a different thing to laugh and to have joy with those who are experiencing these same things, who are witnessing, who are doing what they can. It's a different thing. It feels like that's in spite of, because obviously one of the things that the imperialist powers are hoping, and the nationalist powers of this world are that ordinary people give up, that people who otherwise would pose as a threat to their power and to their warmongering just fall to despair and be like, I can't do anything. I am still a very strong believer in this conception of people power, even though it has been very disappointing and in some ways just not enough. But so yeah, and I agree with ideas that rest is resistance and joy is resistance. I've seen a lot of people use those phrases to really give themselves a pat on the back and to relieve themselves of this sort of duty. Because I'm sorry, Becky, but no, rest for you is not resistance, Joy for a white middle class person is not resistance, you know what I mean? I don't know. Sorry, I don't want to get into that actually. It's a subject of a totally different episode that I actually wanted to record today about a kind of thing I've been thinking about around the concept of soft white supremacy, which I think is much more insidious and actually such a huge threat that's really much harder to pinpoint than, let's say, literal neo-Nazis marching through the street. But I can only speak, as a migrant, as someone who comes from the Middle East, from the Swana region, is a very, this sort of soft white supremacy. I'm not going to talk about it now. It's a different episode, but that's definitely been on my mind, and so that came out a little bit. Again, in the same way that I'm deflecting and refusing to just... Well, it's because I don't know how to talk emotionally. I can talk intellectually. I can be present emotionally, if I'm crying or whatever, but... Honestly, where the fuck do we go from here? Things have gotten to the level where it's so intense and will only get more intense as time goes on, as climate collapse becomes more evident. I think this summer is going to be tremendously fucked up and is really going to demonstrate, how urgent things are everywhere. And so no one gets a pass. I hate to say this, and me especially, because I feel like I'm doing what I can, and I've done a lot, and I feel exhausted, and I feel like I just need to take a huge break, but nobody gets a pass. And especially not people with access to some forms of privilege, And again, it sucks, but the reality is, if you're not traumatized, you are privileged. If you're not thinking about how are you going to feed yourself or your family tomorrow, or what's the security situation going to be like tomorrow, you are privileged. And that comes with a kind of responsibility, a kind of duty. If you believe things need to change, you are the one to do it. No one's going to come save us. And we need to save ourselves. And God, I have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about, but this picture has really fucked me up, and again has just been another example of how fucked things are and how separate the worlds are. Those of us who have seen this picture, who are seeing all these pictures, and those who are just reading about it in the newspapers, in the magazines that only talk about the hostages, or only talk about Hamas, or only talk from the Israeli perspective. And there's this huge split, which again is a very emotional, very psychological split. I cannot go out of the house. I do not want to talk to people. I am so vulnerable and raw all the time. I went to the grocery store the other day and I just found myself weeping, at the abundance of food. Again, I'm also just very wary of me being kind of needlessly masochistic here. And again, to center myself, I only center myself to give an example, to serve as a kind of, hey, I know a lot of you are hurting in a similar way. And literally just identifying it, I think, is a bit helpful. And yeah, if we want to become, as I've been saying, agents of change, kind of actual actors that hold some sort of power, even in ourselves or over ourselves, yeah, we need to talk about these things. And so, yeah, I don't know if I made a single valuable point there, but I think I've kind of exercised from my body what I wanted there. And yeah, that's been another episode of Politically Depressed. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, or, I don't know, relate in some way. As always, if you want to reach out, I would love it. Please do. Either through Instagram or through email, Patreon, whatever. I appreciate every message that anyone sends me. And yeah, that's about it. I'll see you all next week.